Hello, my name is Reginald Santiel, and today I'll be presenting my final project titled Sex vs. Gender, United States of Inequalities. This presentation addresses how systemic structures in our country reinforce the conflation of sex and gender, contributing to inequality for those who do not conform to traditional male-female categories. As we move through the slides, I'll connect academic theory with current events to show how these systems impact lives and offer actionable insights. In the United States, the persistent conflation of sex and gender, reinforced by scientific discourse, legal systems, and educational institutions, upholds systemic inequalities that marginalize individuals who do not conform to binary norms. This research argues that dismantling these inequalities requires recognizing sex and gender as distinct, socially constructed spectrums rather than fixed biological absolutes, and adopting inclusive, pedagogical, linguistic, and policy strategies that challenge hegemonic masculinity and heteronormativity. This thesis sets the tone for my project. The confusion between sex and gender leads to real-world harm and marginalization. By viewing sex and gender as socially constructed and not biologically determined absolutes, we can begin dismantling the systems that perpetrate inequality. This argument runs through the entire presentation, from science textbooks to public law to healthcare policies. To continue on my thesis, again, the presentation challenges sex-gender binary. It uses both academic text and real-world events to show the impact of this conflation. I will examine solutions through education, policy, and inclusive language. Why this project matters. So, it's not just about identity politics or academic debate. When systems assume everyone is male or female based solely on biology, people outside those categories are made invisible. From being denied health care to exclusion in education and sports, the consequences are widespread. We have to ask ourselves, who does this binary serve? Or what would be possible if we thought beyond it? So, science isn't neutral. Emily Martin's anthropological work proves that gender roles influence even our most objective sciences. Her analysis of sperm and egg descriptions in her textbooks show how male is seen as active and female as passive. This isn't just semantics. It shapes how young people learn about biology, bodies, and roles. Martin asks us to interrogate how science may replicate social biases rather than challenge them. She says, part of the strength of science is that it can be held up to social scrutiny. In Fossil Sterling's The Five Sexes, he disrupts the illusion of a two-sex model by introducing at least 5 sex categories based on real intersex conditions. The fact that doctors still surgically assign newborns to binary categories proves society's obsession with normalcy. Her follow-up in 2000 clarifies that these were illustrative categories, not rigid ones, used to push forward a broader understanding of sex as fluid, not fixed. Sex does not equal gender. So, students often confuse sex with gender. Uh, Cipriani uses interactive classroom language to challenge assumptions. In her 2023 lecture, she builds on the themes of pedagogical transformation with critical engagement with the constructs of sex and gender. In her undergraduate media studies course, Cipriani used assignments, media analysis, and uncomfortable classroom conversations to challenge the binary logic that students often bring with them into academic settings. She emphasizes that discomfort is productive. It forces students to confront what they've taken for granted. Her critical pedagogical approach aligns with feminist and cultural theories that argue gender is a social performance, not a biological fate. This lecture is crucial to my project because it illustrates that education is not a neutral space. It's a space of ideological formation. If classrooms reinforce binary thinking, then education becomes a tool of oppression. But Cipriani proves that classrooms can also become sites of liberation. By breaking down the assumed link between sex and gender, she gives her students permission to reimagine identity on a more inclusive terms. Her work directly supports the thesis that educational institutions must play an active role in dismantling hegemonic masculinity and binary gender norms. Her quote, "Sex does not equal gender," is more than a slogan. It's a pedagogical necessity. It underscores the importance of moving beyond catchphrases towards structural shifts in teaching and learning. Hegemonic masculinity in schools. So, the anthology edited by Amber George and Russell Waltz, Critical Pedagogical Strategies to Transcend Hegemonic Masculinity, explores how toxic masculinity operates in educational settings. The contributors examine how masculinity is reinforced in classroom behavior, expectations, grading practices, and the general privileging of masculine coded behaviors such as assertiveness, competitiveness, and emotional restraint. These expectations don't just hurt women, non binary, and queer students, they also limit men who don't conform to hegemonic ideals of masculinity. This slide is pivotal because it shifts the focus from individual acts of discrimination to the broader structural mechanisms by which masculinity is enforced and rewarded in schools. It supports my thesis that educational systems uphold binary and hierarchical gender norms. If educators fail to question these norms, then schools become breeding grounds for continued inequality. One of the most compelling arguments from the text is that masculinity is not only performed but institutionalized. This means it's not enough to ask students to behave differently. We must change what the institution rewards. As the editors state, gender is what you do, not as much who you are, reminding us that gender is an ongoing practice shaped and reinforced by power. Economic inequality. So, this slide draws from the work of Brian Robinson and global researchers Ortiz Ospina and Roser, who they show that gender-based economic inequality remains persistent even in 2025. Robinson outlines how unconscious bias, poor representation, and wage disparities affect professional opportunities for women and gender minorities. Ortiz Ospina and Roser back this up with global data that show long-term gender gaps in income, employment, and education, even in countries considered progressive. This information is central to my project because it offers quantifiable evidence that binary gender norms have material consequences. When we assume fixed roles, men as leaders, women as caretakers, we undervalue and underpay gender diverse labor. These disparities are not anomalies. They are patterns built into systems that were never designed with equity in mind. By combining narrative, reporting, and empirical data, this slide reinforces the idea that gender inequality isn't about individual failure or choice. It's systemic. The quote from Robinson, "Gender equity isn't just a women's issue, it's a human rights issue, a business imperative, and a social necessity," captures why this issue must be tackled across sectors, including business education and public policy. Healthcare bias. In healthcare, the consequences of sex gender conflation are not just philosophical, they're deadly. The narrative review from Health Services Research and reporting from Medical News Today show how gender bias leads to poorer outcomes for women and LGBTQ patients. Women's symptoms are often dismissed as psychological, and transgender patients may be denied care altogether due to systemic ignorance or prejudice. This bias is built into a medical model that views the cisgender male body as the default. When this happens, everyone else becomes other or abnormal, which has implications for diagnosis, treatment plans, and even clinical trials. These sources advocate for broad reforms in how healthcare professionals are trained and how systems are structured. This is a crucial piece of the presentation as it demonstrates how deeply institutionalized these binaries are. When people are harmed by a system that is supposed to heal, it is a clear sign that reform is urgent. This slide shows that dismantling binary thinking is not just a theoretical exercise, it has the potential to save lives. When we understand that treating everyone the same still centers cis male norms, we open the door for true inclusivity in health and healing. Resistance and reform. Hazel and Kleinman's 2019 article focuses on strategies of resistance to binary enforcement, emphasizing community-based interventions and inclusive policy reforms. Their work bridges the gap between theory and practice by showcasing how real people are working to dismantle gender binaries in their communities, classrooms, and professional environments. This is vital to my project because it provides a hopeful, action oriented counterpoint to the systemic issues we've discussed so far. It supports my thesis by showing that binary gender ideologies are not natural or inevitable. They are constructed and can be deconstructed. By highlighting examples of activism and institutional reform, Hazel and Kleiman underscore the importance of intersectional, grassroots approaches to change. Their quote, persistent inequalities necessitate a multifaceted approach to resistance, reminds us that no single reform will suffice. We need coordinated action across legal, educational, medical, and cultural spheres. This slide prepares the audience to consider how resistance can happen in their own spaces, from advocating for inclusive language in the classroom to supporting logical policies that protect gender diverse communities. Executive Order 14201. In this slide, we turn to a timely and controversial policy, Executive Order 14201, signed by President Donald Trump in February 2025. This policy mandates that federally funded schools must define sex strictly according to a person's assigned sex at birth, as recorded on their birth certificate. While this may seem like an administrative detail, its implications are severe. Most notably, it effectively bans transgender women from participating in women's sports, regardless of their lived identity or medical transition. This order does not reflect modern scientific understanding about gender diversity, nor does it consider the real life experiences of trans individuals. Instead, it codifies binary gender ideology into law, reinforcing a world view that sees male and female as fixed, unchangeable categories. By including this executive order in my presentation, I emphasize how institutional power can enforce outdated and discriminatory beliefs. Policies like this have ripple effects, not just in sports, but in educational access, psychological well-being, and public discourse. This case illustrates exactly why it's so urgent to distinguish sex from gender and to protect the rights of all individuals, not just those who fit neatly into societal norms. The law isn't neutral, it either includes or it excludes. And in this case, it clearly marginalizes an already vulnerable population. What can we do? So, this slide focuses on tangible steps we can take to create a more inclusive environment or more inclusive environments. First, we need to revise school curricula to include critical gender theory, including works from scholars like Judith Butler, Anne Fausto Sterling, and Emily Martin. When students are taught to question and deconstruct binaries early, they become better citizens and more empathetic leaders. Second, we must train healthcare professionals, educators, and administrators to recognize gender bias and practice inclusive care. This includes using correct pronouns, respecting gender identity in records, and challenging assumptions in everyday interactions. Third, we need to pass laws and policies that protect people of all gender identities. This means advocating for gender inclusive restroom access, equitable sports participation, and non-discrimination protections in employment and education. Real change begins with cultural awareness and policy reform, but it requires everyday participation. It's not just about big, sweeping reforms. Change also happens when we choose inclusive language, question stereotypes, and support marginalized voices in our communities. Every classroom, clinic, and court ruling matters. So the question becomes, how are we, as individuals and as a society, choosing to participate in that change? As we near the end of this presentation, I want to leave you with two discussion questions designed to help deepen your thinking. First, how do science, law, and education reinforce binary gender norms, whether overtly or subtly? This question invites you to reflect on the material we've covered and consider how these institutions can either challenge or perpetrate inequality. Think about the examples we've seen, like gendered metaphors in biology, binary classification in healthcare forms, or legislation like Executive Order 14201. These are not isolated incidents, they are part of a broader pattern. The second question is more imaginative. What would society look like if we fully embrace sex and gender as fluid concepts? What new possibilities could emerge in law, healthcare, sports, education, and everyday life? This question is vital because imagining alternatives is the first step toward building them. If we can't envision more inclusive futures, we can't create them. I encourage you to use these questions as springboards for further conversation, personal reflection, or even activism. This final slide contains a annotated bibliography with full MLA formatted, works cited, that can be seen via a QR code. I encourage everyone to explore these sources further. They offer deep insights into the complexities of sex and gender beyond what could be covered in a single presentation. The academic and journalistic work done by people like Emily Martin and Fausto Sterling and Maria Cipriani provides a solid foundation for this project, but also points the way toward more research, activism, and change.